We recognize that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As always, I like to share a little visual of native-land.ca. It's a really great resource that started off in Canada, but has now gone global. Certain regions are very, very well represented, such as ours, where we can see lots of different Indigenous cultures and languages and treaties for our region. So feel free to check out yours. I guess this isn't Jess's, but anyways, Jess, I'm sure you know it quite well as well. So today we are here to welcome Jess Vickruck, and she's going to be talking on the role of landscape heterogeneity and supporting wild bee biodiversity in Canadian agroecosystems. She did her undergraduate degree at Guelph and her master's and PhDs at Brock in the Richards Lab. Then after that, she completed a postdoc at Calgary in the Galperin Lab. And she's now, since 2019, been a research scientist in Agriculture and Agri-food Canada.
So thanks for coming on a Friday when the world is in a very strange place to listen to me talk about bees and landscape. So I'm going to talk about work that I've mostly been doing, or colleagues or collaborators have been doing with me since I was in Calgary, and then also since I've moved out east here to New Brunswick. So actually, yeah, there's another map for you. So while you guys are in Ontario, I am out here in Fredericton, which is the unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik people. And I also work in the regions which are traditionally a Mi'kmaq territory, as well as Passamaquoddy and Penobscot. So these regions are collectively form the Wabanaki Confederacy, which was a very powerful confederacy up until about the 1800s, when colonial rule disbanded most Indigenous governance systems. But it was actually the Wabanaki Confederacy sort of reformed in 1993, and they relit the flame. And actually since then, that flame has never gone out. So this is just sort of where I'm coming. I'm the little black dot down here at the bottom in Fredericton, Ibrahak. So, I mean, this is a group of very knowledgeable bee folk. And so, I don't think I need to talk, at length about the importance of wild pollinators or their contributions to global economy. Sort of my goal today was to talk about sort of landscape changes and how those impact the bee community and how we can what we can learn from the natural bits that are left. So, landscape simplification drastically changes how organisms interact with their environment, not just bees, but all organisms really. And here I have two sort of screenshots. The one on the left is from Alberta, and the one on the right is from New Brunswick. But I mean, you can see that these are aerial views, that there's some little pothole wetlands down here. There's different elevations. You can see different green intensities, which very likely indicate different species, plant species, and what happens is that, we go out and we convert these landscapes to agricultural ones, and it drastically changes how they look. And having never spent a lot of time in the prairies when I moved out to Calgary, I was just completely dumbfounded by the sheer scale at which agriculture happens out there. And so this bottom image here is the Dominion Land Survey, more colonial stuff, divided everything up into these sort of perfect squares. And four of these together, they call a section, and each one of these little squares they would refer to as a quarter section. And each of those is 800 meters across. So if you're farming a whole section, which is not uncommon, that's 1.6 kilometers of monoculture. So an absolutely massive simplification of the landscape. And even in New Brunswick, it's a bit of a different system because we're working from a predominantly forested starting point, but you can see how this drastically changes the landscape that we're in. And I mean, I think perhaps the important thing to note here is just that, these are all of these services are all connected. And so especially now that I come from or I work in sort of an applied space where, often if you want to get money or get grants for things, you somehow have to relate it back to people. But if you follow that back, I mean, this is from a lovely meta-analysis that looked at globally how landscape simplification from all across the world impacted different sort of levels of this system. And landscape simplification has a significantly negative impact on pollinator species richness, but pollinator species richness has a significant positive impact on pollination and through to production and yield. And there's a similar sort of pattern here with evenness. But this all to say that the way that we change our landscape has massive implications for the pollinators, and then also us, if that's how you have to play it to get people to listen. And so I've been working mostly with wild bees in sort of non-pollinator dependent crops. And I think there's more and more recognition that even in these crops that traditionally we thought, oh, we don't need bees, we don't need pollinators for our yield. It's not a strawberry, it's not an apple. But we know now that even in canola, insect visitation, yeah, it's wind pollinated, but insect visitation really will increase your yield. And there's some evidence for this in soy as well. And even if it doesn't matter to the crop necessarily, it certainly matters to the bees. So, there's a lot of potato out here, a lot of potato. And I learned this, I probably should have known this before I got here, but, potato isn't planted from true seed. You plant a potato in the ground. So the actual potato flower is not important to the growers, but it's probably playing some sort of role in how the bees are viewing it. And that these annual cropping systems pose different challenges to those of perennial ones, which is kind of obvious. If you're constantly tilling the ground and disturbing things, you're going to have a different suite of problems than you would if you're working in an orchard or something that's less disturbed. So when we think about designing bees for landscapes, it always seems to come back to the fact that bees are central place foragers. So, where they make their nest has huge implications for almost anything else, because they have to come back to that point over and over again. So this is a really simplified sort of illustration here. We have a nest here in the middle and then flowers at different distances. And we know that bees that are smaller, just because their body size is smaller, they aren't able to fly as far or don't tend to fly as far out to flowers, whereas larger bees may be able to fly further distances. So, where a bee nests has implications for where she can get to. And we also know that even within a species, the distance that a female has to fly to collect pollen has implications on lots of different levels. So this female that can fly out to this flower that's quite close, and then we have this female that has to fly out to this flower that's quite far away. And so, if you spend twice as much time commuting, I mean, I think about people who, do their daily commute to work every day. There's only so many hours in a day, and if you spend twice as much time commuting, then you have less time. These females make fewer pollen trips. They accumulate wing wear faster because they're just spending so much more time flying. And then there's evidence that, especially in solitary species, these bees have their nests have higher levels of parasitism because, in theory, they're left open for longer while the female is out foraging. So this relationship between nests and flowers and where they are in the landscape has really big implications. And in the prairies, we see really, what's left after we get past this sort of agricultural state, which, from a bee's perspective, there's nothing in here. Maybe the occasional weed, but nothing that would be sustaining. Plus, it gets tilled, so that's not going to be very helpful. But there are these regions that have pivot corners. And so what happens is, it's actually, these fields are so large. So imagine that this field is 800 meters across. And so there's actually a post for those of you who don't know how pivot irrigation works, there's a really large post here in the center, and there's a 400-meter long arm that comes out that basically that waters all along this arm, and it pivots around in a circle. It's all very high tech now. Growers can sit in their offices and watch the pivot corners go around. Anyway, but you can imagine that when you put a circle and a square, you end up with these corner bits that aren't being irrigated. And so most growers actually they'll use them as pasture or forage. And so this undisturbed space has the potential to be used by pollinators. And then the other sort of remaining feature are these pothole wetlands. And so these were carved out during the last glaciation. And they used to, 30 years ago, pay people to drain them because they were just taking up space in their field. But, there's been obviously a recognition that, perhaps these are important and perhaps we should not. And so there's been a real push to drain them and also potentially to restore them. So because we knew there'd been a lot of work, not a lot, but a decent amount of work in the prairies on wetlands, infield wetlands, on their role in supporting aquatic invertebrates, and also how agricultural practices impacted those invertebrates in terms of runoff and things like that. But around the outside of these wetlands, there is a considerable margin usually that's left. And we were interested in understanding if those regions were being used by wild bees in the area. Because, if you look at that landscape, that's one of the only places really that could be potential habitat. So we operated, with this assumption that, the area around this is sort of a wasteland. But, if a female bee was nesting here at the margin, and we'd have a whole community of bees, that if you sampled further out, we would see a change in the community structure. So that was what we did. We sampled, so you might suspect that as we move further into the field here, we sample at this sort of closer edge. So if we take this box as sort of, this is your whole community, as we move out, we might lose a couple of the smaller bodied species. And if we move further out, then we might lose more species. So that was sort of the prediction that we were using with this study. So we worked across 3 different land use types. So we had canola and wheat, which are the 2 prominent crops out in the area that we had. And then we also replicated the same design in protected rangeland areas, so pothole wetlands that were located within a rangeland area, with the idea being that in the 2 tilled ag fields and your canola and your wheat, once you got past that wetland margin, there in theory wasn't much suitable habitat available. But in a grassland scenario, that you would have potentially, good nest sites and floral resources throughout the field. So we should see a different pattern in those setups. And so that's exactly, it's pretty much what we saw. So the x-axis here is the distance from the wetland margin in meters. And the y-axis is essentially a trap rate. So a proxy for abundance. And so for cereal here in black and the canola here in yellow, what we see is as we get further away from the wetland margin, we see a decrease in the number of bees that we catch. But we don't see this, as we sort of predicted, we don't see this in the grassland setting, where in theory we should have available nesting and floral resources throughout the landscape. And so you see a significant effect of the distance from wetland and the interaction for wetland and grassland. In terms of species richness, actually this trend is even stronger. Again, with the x-axis is the same here, distance from wetland, and now the y is species richness. And so as you move away from that wetland margin, you see fewer species, but we actually see an increase in species richness, so a really strong interaction effect with the grassland species. And we hypothesize that this probably means that, in an agricultural field in that wetland, the wetland margin is all the bees probably have. But in a grassland setting, maybe close to the wetland margin is a bit too wet, or once you get further into the grassland, there are more cavities available for trap nesters. So there actually might be an increase in nest site availability further away from the wetland in those more undisturbed areas. In terms of looking at the actual communities, this is sort of, it was kind of fun that this fell out. So this figure is an NMDS, so it looks at how communities change across sort of two different axes that best describe the variation that we see. And so you can color code these points however you want. And so initially when I made this figure, so each one of these points represents a site at a different distance from the wetland margin. And so originally I had color coded these by the different distances from the wetland margin, and we didn't actually see much of a clustering in terms of how everything fell out. But if you color them by the site, by whether we were in canola or grassland or cereal, you notice that the grassland species tended to fall out here on the left-hand side of axis 1. So there's definitely an advantage, or there's definitely a difference to these communities. And I suspect that it's just that they, if we go back to the last slide, that they're more diverse. So it's interesting, so we didn't know about a lot of people doing bee work in wetlands when it was happening in Alberta, but there's been quite a few papers that have come out since then. So I think that it's becoming a bit more studied, but they certainly seem to be using these margins as potential habitat, although they may not be able to provide, all of the sort of cavity and stem nesting habitat types that may be required, which was why in the grasslands we saw that species diversity go up when we got further away. Okay, so I know this is I'm talking to a bunch of bee people, so if you need to cover your ears and eyes for like 2 sides about not bees, because it goes so well. So when we were working at these sites, we were also using pitfall traps because we were interested in the other natural enemies that are there. So the pollinators, but also the enemies of crop pests, the insects that will go in and eat your cereal leaf beetle or your aphids and things like that. And so Sam Robinson is a postdoc, and so he was actually able to use this expanded data set. So he looked at the sites that we had, but then also sites that he was able to collect from throughout the landscape. And because bees, see, I can't even stop doing it. Because these insects aren't central place foragers, we can't make the same predictions about how they're going to move through these landscapes. And so in particular, we looked at Pterosticus melanarius, which is the carabid beetle, actually an introduced carabid, but by far the most abundant carabid we see. They're actually really interesting. They have 2 wing morphs. They have a short and a long wing morph, and the short wing morph is flightless. And so they tend to move through the landscape by the long winged morphs making jumps and then the short winged ones following. Anyway, and then Protosemosta, which is the common predatory spider in the area. But so what was interesting here is that actually, so canola would draw, for these 2 species, canola would draw them in the spring. So they actually moved into the fields, into the canola fields in the spring and moved back out by the late summer and into the early fall. And so what we think might be happening here is that they actually move into the crop because that's where they can find food. So they'll go in and eat other insects in the crop, which actually, is might be really beneficial as we might not be giving them the credit that they deserve in terms of their ability as natural enemies to help control crop pests. But then moving back into these habitats in the fall sort of indicates that this is where they overwinter and then they come back out. So it looks like these species are also using these sort of edge habitats as refuge, and then going in and doing beneficial things in the crop during the year. So right as I was actually, I was on maternity leave, and Emily Purvis started in the lab, and Emily is a fabulous master's student. And so I just finished field work and she came in. And so because we knew that, now we knew that the bees were using these wetlands, and we thought, okay, there's a bit of a push in Alberta to restore wetlands. And so organizations like Alice and Ducks Unlimited can actually provide growers with funds to restore wetlands in your field. And so we were interested in how that works and if it was effective, and how the bees came back essentially. And Ducks Unlimited had this absolutely amazing data set of all of the wetlands that they had restored in the last 60 years. And it was amazing. It was this amazing resource to work with. So we went through and picked, a chronoseries of wetlands that had been restored within the last 60 years, as well as some that had always been protected and some cropland sites, and looked at, how the year since restoration impacted the bee community and the flower community that we saw. And so we learned that bees return to these restored sites in different ways. So the axis here is the result probably of me, I'm gonna say, constantly pestering the folks in Calgary when I was there, because there is this, and I don't know if it's still as common, but in bee community ecology, they always talk about social species and the solitary species. And what I learned was that they don't actually mean social and solitary, they mean bumblebees and everything else. And so there was this constant where they would talk about the solitary bees, and I would say, no, there's a lot of bees, there are a lot of species in there that are not solitary. Anyway, so we, perhaps a clunkier way to go about it, but we call them the Bombus and the non-Bombus, so everything that isn't Bombus, some of which are not solitary, but they're not Bombus. Anyway, I digress. So it looks like in this situation, the yellow here is cropland, and then 1 to 4 years since restoration, 5 to 10 years, 20 years, and then our reference sites here. So, if we look at all of the bees together, it looks like the bees sort of recolonize these areas absolutely rapidly. But what actually is happening is, if you look at just the Bombus, they're coming back and we find them in these sites really quickly, which we suspect is because they have, compared to most of the other species in this group, have a larger body size that allows them to, so they're probably not nesting in these sites, but we're finding them in these sites because they can commute in. Whereas with the non-Bombus, so all of the other species, it took them between 5 and 10 years before we started to see that those communities resembled the reference at the top here. So this is very likely because it takes longer for those species to be able to fly in, and then they're probably beginning to nest in there as well. Bare ground correlated with non-bumblebee abundance. So if you put the whole data set in there, there wasn't as much of a trend. But in the non-Bombus, and of course there's lots and lots of noise in here. But it's interesting because people do a lot of arm waving about, bare ground is important for bees, and it's always really hard to quantify that. So we had actually taken a whole bunch of quadrats and assessed floral availability, but also bare ground availability, and some properties of the soil as well. But the amount of bare ground was important for the amount of, or the abundance of non-bumblebees, which is probably because of the ground nesters that are using it. But interestingly, there wasn't a pattern with abundance. So, whether or not we looked at this whole data set together, or we looked at just the bumblebees or the non-bumblebees, we didn't see abundance patterns. And I thought that was quite interesting. And yet you'll see in a bit that it's not uncommon, or it doesn't seem to be in some of the work that I've done. So this was really interesting. And I think shows that, the species are coming back in different ways, and I'd love to do some more functional work to see, in terms of nesting guilds and things like that. So yeah, so there's no obvious clustering by restoration age. So again, this is an MDS plot coded, and the color codes here are still by site type. And we don't see that, there isn't really any obvious patterns that come out of this figure. Everything is sort of scattered along these two axes. But if you look at the flowers, they sort of nest inside each other. So the cropland, and then they work their way out. And didn't show this figure, but it takes the flowers way longer than the bees to get back to close to what the reference sites look like. So the bees return rapidly, but the flowers, it takes them longer. So we learned that the bumblebees can be found rapidly at these restored sites, but the non-bumblebees do take longer. And we had tried assessing nest site availability at all of these sites. And all of the parameters came back as not being significant determinants of abundance or richness. And I think that speaks less to the fact that nest sites aren't important, and just that we're just really not good at being able to quantify nest site availability, and it's really, really hard. Because I really think that the nest sites are what's driving it, but I need to find some good ways to assess it. If anyone has any ideas, I'd love to hear about them. And there's lots of questions that I love to answer. So these are all this work so far has been about communities and abundance and richness, but I think there's a lot to be said for the functional diversity of these communities, solitary and social and parasitic species and the nesting guilds. So there's lots of questions left, that we can even answer with this data if we have more time. So, I jumped from one place to the other and moved from Alberta out here to New Brunswick. And the way they're very different systems. And the thing I hadn't, or one thing that became really apparent is that in Alberta, we are converting grassland, prairie grassland to agricultural fields. And in New Brunswick, we're converting forest. So it's very different. Agriculture it happens on a smaller scale in New Brunswick. It's a smaller province, but also because I think, the amount of work that's needed to clear, you have to cut down all the trees and you have to pull stumps, and it's a lot more intensive to get to the phase where you can start sowing seeds. And it also, we're starting from a very different place. And so, these patterns that we see out west in these prairie grassland regions, and do the conclusions that we draw from those studies, how applicable are they in a setting like this where we're dealing with converting two very different land types? And so this is really, when I started with Canada, there was a group of soil scientists that were doing this big Atlantic Canada soil survey. And so I sort of jumped on. I was like, soil, yeah, bees, soil. Actually, though, I was really excited about that because I've always been interested in nest site preferences. And so I thought we tried to do some nest site sampling in Alberta, especially with the ground nesting stuff. But it's harder, working with a bunch of soil scientists, and this is what they do, and they were going to collect all these parameters anyway. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is great. We'll go and collect. We can tag into these sites and collect some bees along with them. And so the summer, and then COVID happened, and we weren't allowed to leave the province. And so the sampling that summer got a bit downsized, but we were able to sample sort of across New Brunswick. And at the time, we weren't allowed to have any students or anything of the sort. And so Pam is my absolutely fabulous technician who hates having her picture taken and would probably be really frustrated that I had, hopefully she wouldn't be mad at me, but her and I drove about 12,500 kilometers across New Brunswick in the summer of 2020, collecting bees. And so we did this sort of on a core scale. We selected sites that were across agricultural settings, pasture settings, forest, and wetland. And I once you start working with soil scientists, I kept saying to them, well, agriculture and pasture, that's all agriculture. But I guess in terms of how the soil scientists and how the soil works, it's really not. So we differentiated across these 4 sites. And at the same time, I had this fabulous 4th year honor student, Naomi, who took on starting to look at some of this data at a time when no one had access to campus. We dropped bees and everything off at her door of her apartment, and she did all of this so incredibly independently, you know, and was such a great driver of this project. And so she was able to look at our first collection of bees through the spring, and found that across these 4 land use types, there wasn't a difference in abundance, which, if you remember back to the work that Emily had done, she was seeing the same sort of pattern. So bumblebee abundance on the y-axis here, and land use type on the x. But if we looked at the disturbed sites, they actually had a higher species richness than the undisturbed sites, which was interesting and a bit unexpected. And I think what was driving this is that there were no parasitic species collected from the forest and the wetland sites. And so what we really need to go back now, and assess the flowers a bit more. So I think, you know, I give this a similar talk about this to someone, and they got really concerned that I was that you know, we were going to then insinuate that, look, you know, agriculture is good for bees, we get more of them, and I was like, this is not, no. But I think that, you know, it may be that there are more floral resources available in these you know, outer margins of these fields, and that they're drawing bees in, which, you know, may actually be a sink. You know, we may be drawing them in to habitats that are ultimately not good for them. So I think that, you know, this is sort of a stepping off point from there, but an interesting pattern, I think, nonetheless. And so what we really need to do is expand this work. And I have a wonderful master's student, Elmira, who hopefully this summer is going to be sampling across the Maritimes. And I've learned that the Maritimes is different from Atlantic Canada. I was corrected on that one. But we also really need to get a better understanding of the floor resources and hopefully some of the nesting resources. And Elmira is really interested in the patterns across functional groups as well. So she is currently choosing, well, so we have sites selected, and now she's trying to pick a subset of sites. And so she's really excited to embark on her first field season this year, which hopefully will start soon, although it's kind of hard to imagine since it's about -20 in Fredericton today. So I think, you know, bringing this all back together, unmanaged bees are clearly using these semi-natural habitats. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of debate about that. But we need to look deeper into nests. You know, flowers are easy to, not easy, but they're you know, more standardized to count and quantify. But nests are also really important. And the other thing that I think, you know, could really use some work is the effect of crop rotation, the impacts of crop rotation, which is hard to study because we tend to get these grants that are, you know, 2 to 4 years long, and in a somewhere that has a 3 to 4 year rotation cycle, you know, you need 8 to 12 years of data so you can get through 2 to 3 full cycles to see what's happening. But, you know, I think there's been a bit of, you know, the idea that the way that crop rotation works also can really impact things, because if you have a crop one year that has floral resources, or sometimes the growers will let the field go fallow for a year, or they'll seed it for a year, and so then there'll be, you know, an abundance of resources, and then the next year they'll till it and plant potatoes. So there's this cycle of, you know, potentially, you know, attraction and then lack of resources. So I think that that's something really important, but also really challenging to study. And then those effects and impacts on functional diversity as well. So because I'm in a group with bee people, if anyone has any interest in collaborating or questions, we also have a project starting that is looking at potato pollen use by unmanaged bees, which, you know, may seem a bit counterintuitive because the potatoes don't need it. But one of the things that we want to make sure that I want to understand better is that there's a real there are lots of incentive programs right now for growers to plant flower strips and things like that. And aside from those resources going in, you know, all of these, especially potato, is a very high input crop. And so there's lots of things that get sprayed on it. And, you know, we're bringing these flower strips in, but then are the bees going into the potato, and does that have negative impacts? So really hardly any research has been done looking at those kinds of effects. And then I think I alluded to this a little bit earlier, is that I'm also interested in the other beneficial insect groups. So the carabid beetles, and then also collembola, which, you know, are growing on me. They're, you know, springtails. They're really adorable, but they're sort of the soil microarthropods that are really involved in the soil carbon cycle. So I'm now working on the soil, and then the ground level stuff, and then the, you know, flying pollinators, just to make things as complicated as possible. But I really think that in terms of beneficial insects and agricultural systems, to try and capture, you know, those three things is really a powerful tool. And if we're out there working at these sites, then, you know, it would be good to capitalize on the data that we get. And so these projects have been, you know, there's been so many people involved in all of these projects. Megan and Patrick and Danielle and Melvina, Michael and Sarah and Amy and Natasha, all of these field assistants in Calgary that were driving around collecting. And then of course, Pam, who spent a ton of time driving around with me in the summer of 2020. And then Aaron and Maggie, who were involved in helping to process some of these samples this past summer. And of course, all the funding bodies that give us money and allow us to get this kind of stuff done. And yeah, so thanks for listening to me on a Friday afternoon. I guess it's just not quite noon for you yet, but Friday afternoon. And if you have any questions for me, I would be more than happy to attempt to answer them.